I would have to say that's pretty good speech writing on the fly, Brandon. Not bad. Not bad. Two completely different ones today, both entirely memorable. Big round of applause for Brandon Marshall. Another highlight of the evening is our next guest, Mariel Hemingway, accomplished actress, writer, mental health advocate, grandchild of one of the greatest storytellers ever, Ernest Hemingway, and has been very honest and straightforward, talking about her family struggles with mental illness, with addiction, with suicide. And in fact, recently, she documented her family story in a documentary called Running from Crazy, which was honored with the Humanitarian Award at the San Diego Film Festival. It's a great honor to have Mariel Hemingway here tonight. Please give her a round of applause.
Wow, I feel like I have such white girl problems. After you, Brandon, you're amazing. I'd like to take a moment before I start, and I'd like to invite everybody to just close their eyes. Close your eyes and inhale deeply, and exhale, and inhale, and exhale, and inhale again, and exhale. And with your eyes still closed, just take a moment to think of something that you're grateful for. Someone, something, the fact that you got here tonight, these amazing, amazing people in this room who are doing such good. Something that will bring a smile to your face and make you feel a little bit better about your world. And then open your eyes. I do that because when I'm nervous, I do that. And I also do that because it helps connect us all. We are all very much connected. And I believe that mental illness, stress, addiction, all of these things, we all suffer from them. Whether we personally suffer from an addiction, or we personally suffer from a mental illness, or we have a friend or a family member, or we've lost somebody that we love, or we have a coworker, somebody in our lives is affected by mental illness every single day. And some of you probably don't even know the friends of yours, or maybe even family members that are suffering, that are so afraid to speak out. They're so afraid because of the stigma of mental illness. And it seems ridiculous, and it was like Brandon was saying, it's like Patrick has said many times, nobody gets upset when somebody has cancer, and nobody points a finger at them or thinks that they're weird, Look at Brandon, that's one sexy guy. He's not, doesn't have a gorilla head. And because he has suffered from what he's suffered from, he's found a way. And he is affecting millions of people, millions of young men, and millions of people that are affected by mental illness, and they will get help because he speaks out. Because it truly is about telling your story. So I'm going to tell a little bit of my story, not the whole thing, but a little bit of it. As you know, I come from an amazing family. Ernest Hemingway was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, if not the world forever. And he was born not far from here in Oak Park. And he was a creative genius. He was and remains in our hearts and in our minds and in our creativity, and we teach him in schools, and he was extraordinary. And I was always so proud to have come from this amazing family. But when I was young, I really didn't know for the longest time that he shot himself. because my family didn't talk about it. It's just something that we didn't do. We didn't talk about our problems. I grew up in a home that we just didn't speak of those things. And especially when there was anything to do with mental illness or imbalance, I remember overhearing my mother and father speaking about my sister. Now, my oldest sister, who is still alive, suffers from schizophrenia. And it was early on, it was the 60s, and she was doing a lot of drugs, a lot of LSD. I think she said she only took one hit of acid. We think it might have been a bit more. And she was a big problem for my family, and I remember my father saying, well, maybe we should, have her see a psychiatrist. And my mother, I mean, you'd have thought that, something horrible was said. Going to a psychiatrist was like the worst thing that you could possibly do. People would find out. Their friends would find out. What would people think? Crazy, but that still, there's an underlying sense of that still today. Now, something else about my family. I come from 7 suicides, maybe more. My grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, committed suicide. His father committed suicide. My grandmother, Hadley's father, committed suicide. My great uncle committed suicide, another great aunt committed suicide, a cousin committed suicide, an uncle committed suicide, and also my sister Margot Hemingway committed suicide. That's a lot of mental illness. They all suffered from addiction. Addiction is also a mental illness that we sort of want to separate these two, but they all suffered from addiction, and the reason why they suffered from addiction, in my humble opinion, and all you doctors out there, you can lash me afterwards, my humble opinion is they were trying to get out of pain. They were self-medicating to try to get out of this pain, and they knew no other way. It was like your son, Peter, saying, I would rather die an alcoholic than a mental patient, and the pain of that and the conflicting feelings that come with that, I think it's daunting. My grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, suffered and was treated at the Mayo Clinic with shock treatment. He also was very embarrassed, and it was horrible for him. He couldn't write anymore. I mean, it was all those things. But with great creativity, with greatness comes other problems that we need to be able to talk about. So being in this family that had all this trouble, I very early on wanted to be healthy. So I was on a passion to be really incredibly healthy my whole life. I just wanted to find things to make me healthy. My mother had stage 4 cancer when I was growing up, and I became her primary caregiver when I was only 11 years old. So I kept thinking, there's got to be healthy things that we can do. My mother also was depressed, deeply depressed, probably from the cancer and many other things, and her daughters who were having a difficult time growing up. My sister Margot was an alcoholic, and she was bulimic, and she was a supermodel, and she was one of the biggest supermodels of the 70s, but she was suffering so deeply and couldn't get out of that. And that's what my documentary, Running from Crazy, is about, kind of looking at her and looking at the aspect of my family that just couldn't find stability. So I went on a journey to find stability, and it led me towards, like eating every different way. I have tried every diet known to mankind. I thought that this might bring balance to my brain, and I would never get cancer like my mother, and I wouldn't go crazy like my sisters. I exercised too much. I became obsessive and compulsive about everything that I did on this journey to try to find balance, to try to find health. I was searching, and honestly, it wasn't until way too recent that I realized that I'd been depressed most of my life, and I was struggling. I was trying to self-medicate, but I was trying to do it healthily, eating different ways, and exercising too much. That was my way of trying to find something, and it served me to a certain degree. I mean, it was certainly a better choice than drinking too much or taking drugs, but I was still on this search. I finally found something called brain state technology that was helpful for me. But the reason I speak is not because what I do is the only way, is the only solution. The reason I speak is that everybody has to find their own solution. And so what you're doing, Patrick, is you're getting it out there so that everybody can find a solution, so that they know that there are solutions out there. So what Patrick does is different than what I have to do to find my balance. What, you know, and Peter didn't find his balance. It's heartbreaking, but the more we speak, the more we tell our story, the more we can heal. Because once we let the words come out of our mouth, once we say the words of our story, whether it's to a big group of people, which I highly don't recommend, or it's to a family member or your best friend, that's when healing can start. Because that's when you're not in denial that there is a problem. Now, I'm not saying that any of you have any problems. All I'm saying is that when the conversation starts, that's when the network starts to go out there. When Brandon gets on the team and he's wearing his lime green, that's when the conversation bleeds into the entire community, into the country, into the world. This is a global problem. It's been a bigger problem than the diseases that I mentioned before for a lot longer. And there's been more stigma attached to mental illness than any other problem that's affected anybody on planet Earth. We do not like mental illness because we think we've done something wrong. If you suffer from it, you think, I am tainted, I am horrible, and this is awful, I've done something wrong. And if you've suffered and you're a parent and you lose a child, you think, what did I do wrong? Why didn't I see it? Because we're not talking about it, you don't realize that, you know, suicide is bizarre. It's 20 minutes of a bad day for some young child. It's 20 years in the planning for somebody else. It's imbalance in the brain. My passion is to get people to talk about the balance of the body in connection with the balance of the brain, because they go together. You know, why do we think the head is like separate from the body? It's not. So how we live our everyday life, whether we take a moment to be silent and grateful, whether we take a moment to think about the food that we eat and where it comes from, whether we drink water enough, whether we are mindful in our lives, these are important issues that I know they seem kind of trivial, but they're important. They've been important in my journey anyway. And it really is just about your own personal journey, and I can only share that. I can only share my personal journey with finding balance, which is just so important. I'm going to tell one short story that I think is just really, really sweet, and it sort of changed my life. So as you know, well, I'm from California, so hence why you had to meditate. And hence why you're going to hear the next story. And so I was on this journey to be healthy and balanced and all that stuff. So I did a lot of meditating. I've chanted and I've been in you know, all kinds of different caves and teepees and yurts, and I've done a lot of good things. I've had dots on my head. I've gone to India. I loved it, and I learned a lot from it. But this was my search. This was my journey. I was trying to find my balance in my life. Well, there was one journey that I took probably around 10 years ago, maybe more, and it was to meet His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, which is pretty cool. And not really woo-woo. He's a pretty extraordinary human being. So I go to Dharamsala, India to meet His Holiness. Now, it wasn't just me meeting him, but we did get a private audience. It was me and about 10 other people. And everybody that I went with had just extraordinary things that they were going to ask His Holiness, like, you know, how do we create peace on earth, and, you know, like really important stuff. And all I'm thinking is, please don't ask me anything, because God knows I will just look at him and giggle, because that's another thing that I do when I'm nervous. So anyway, we are in this meeting, and he has profound and wise words for everyone that has a question. And I think, oh, it's wonderful. He's so incredible, and he smiles all the time, and he's beautiful, and he's very insightful. He's very, very wise. But I think, okay, I'm going to make it out of here, and I don't have to ask anything. And I am sitting in this chair, and he is sitting in a chair right next to me. And my hand is on the arm of the chair. And he looks over at me, and he smiles. And I smile back. And then he laughs. And then he puts his hand on my hand. And he says, and he looks me in the eye, and he says, "You're okay." And when I tell you that took my breath away, it wasn't because His Holiness was, this spiritual man that told me I was okay. It was because I needed to hear that. I needed to know that I was okay. I'd been searching my whole life for something that would make me feel okay about myself. And I realized that I was the one that had to know that I was okay and that I was okay. And he just smiled and he laughed afterwards. And it was like, wow, I am okay. And so when I go out to speak to groups like you, although this is a pretty powerful and amazing group, I have to say, and you will do big things because there's a lot of chutzpah in this room. So go out there and do incredible things. I do it because I want everybody to know that they're okay, no matter what they're suffering from. You're okay. It doesn't matter what journey you took to find out that you're okay and how crazy you've been getting there, which was my journey. You're okay. And people that suffer from mental illness need to know they're okay and that there's a safe place for them to be. So let's hold a space for people that are suffering so they know that they're okay. Thank you.
I think we will all agree Mariel is far more than okay. Can we get an amen to that? There you go. This has been such an amazing day, and it's going to continue with the speaker I know you all want to hear as well. We've had some just amazing dynamic speakers. Unfortunately, because my duties at the station start in about an hour and 15 minutes, I have to get back and do the 10 o'clock news. But before I do, I want to introduce the man, the reason we are here today at the Kennedy Forum, Illinois. We all know about his family, the world-famous Kennedy family, and all the contributions they've made to this country and the entire world for decades and decades. And he's here to change lives. He's here to end the stigma, and he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's putting himself out there, which if you know anything about mental illness, you know that's not always an easy thing to do. And 16 years in Congress, the author and lead sponsor of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008, and we heard Mayor Emanuel explain exactly how that made it, how it got passed. And he's used his voice and his influence to bring all of us here together today. Think about this room. Look around this room, and you see some really great Chicagoans, some leaders in the community, the business, the political community, the benevolent, the philanthropic community, and we're all here to support mental health awareness, and we're all here to support Patrick Kennedy. Please give him a big round of applause. Thanks for having me. Had a great time.
Thank you so much, Rob. And Rob mentioned his commitment to this cause also derives from his family member with Down syndrome. And I can tell you, Rob, that it was here in Chicago that the Special Olympics started in 1967 in Soldiers Field. So how appropriate is we're here tonight. In Chicago again, to begin to transform the attitudes towards people with mental illness in much the same way we were successful in transforming the attitudes and perceptions of people with intellectual disabilities, thanks to the founding of the Special Olympics, which I know has a lot of supporters in the audience. First of all, let me thank both the governor and the mayor for their presence here tonight, and the lieutenant governor. And of course so many others, the Senate President, President Preckwinkle, all the legislators and aldermen who were with us earlier today. What a testament to this cause that so many elected officials chose to be here at the forum today, from this morning on throughout the day and tonight. And I see Sheriff Dart, who took me through the Cook County Jail last time I was out here, and the mayor and I were speaking about what an abomination it is that our jails are the new asylums. And there's no one who's better spokesperson for the plight of those with mental illness who, because of their illness, are trapped in our criminal justice system when they shouldn't be, than Tom Dart. And Tom, thank you so much for being here. Brandon and Muriel, I just want to say thank you so much for your testimony tonight. We've talked before, and we'll continue to be on the road together in this journey that we're on. I just honestly have to say I'm a little jealous that Muriel gets to go around and have this famous last name that opens so many doors for her. I just think that's just outrageous that, just because of who her family is, they just roll out the red carpet for her. There's something wrong with that. So she talked about being okay. And so, of course, I have to tell the story about the being okay in my life. So when my first child was born, the pressure was on to name him Patrick. And of course, I said, I cannot saddle my son with my name. I've got to find his own unique identity. So we looked around in the list of names for children, and I can tell you there were very few left after I went through all my family names left that I could name my child. But remarkably, there was a Gaelic name that hadn't been used in my family, which I found pretty extraordinary. And we especially, my wife especially, loved it because of the initials. And so we named our son Owen. And we thought, what a great first name, because now he gets to go around for the rest of his life and be okay. So we love that. So Muriel talked about finding balance, and that's a constant struggle when you have a mood disorder coupled with an addictive disorder like I do. But I can tell you in my life, I was able to make great strides in finding balance when I found my partner and my wife, who's here with us tonight, and I want to introduce her to all of you, and that's Amy Kennedy. Amy, can you please? Now, I met Amy because I was asked by my colleagues from New Jersey to attend an ARC convention, and it was an ARC convention that was dedicated to honoring the memory of my late aunt, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. So you can imagine, I thought, this is a slam dunk. I'll go there, they'll love me because I'm Eunice Kennedy Shriver's nephew, And of course, they'll all revere her because of the way she did so much for the developmental disability movement. So I showed up, I gave my remarks, and then, I thought I better work the room a little bit. And then, of course, in the corner of my eye, I caught this beautiful woman in table 123, and I thought, how am I going to get over there to meet her without being too obvious? Because they're going to look at me and say, well, of course she's going to go over there to talk to the most beautiful girl in the room. So I worked my way around quietly, trying to not be so obvious with my intentions. But of course, I introduced myself to my wife, and then later on she told the story that it was obvious to everyone else in the room what I was really doing. So again, the story about these illnesses is we don't know how we appear to others. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. But so I have been blessed because with Amy's support, have enjoyed the longest period of continuous, uninterrupted sobriety. And for those of you who know what it's like trying to remain sober, you can always stop. The challenge is staying stopped. For me, I've had over 3.5 years of continuous sobriety, and I've been very blessed by that. And I have to tell you, it is something that's my priority, but I also know that I want to set a different example for my children. I want to break the cycle, as Muriel talked about, the cycle of mental illness and addiction. Like her family and my family, we didn't talk about it. And as I mentioned this morning, when we were addressing the issue of childhood trauma, and I thought about all of the trauma that this city has endured because of the shootings of so many young people and the violence that's plagued this city, I was reminded about what it was like growing up in my family with the impact of gun violence in my own family and what that did to really obliterate the emotional life and health of all of my family members to one degree or another. So many of my family have continued to be remarkable successes, but it really has been in spite of an incredibly difficult challenge of overcoming the damage that the shootings of my uncles did to every single member of my family. And indirectly for me, because of the impact that it had on my father's life, he was obviously impacted. We didn't know what it was back then. We didn't know what this word post-traumatic stress disorder was. But I can honestly tell you, if there was anyone who was a candidate for post-traumatic stress disorder, it was my father. And I suffered for my father. I ached and pained for his suffering. I internalized his suffering. And my mother also internalized it. And yet she had in her family a whole legacy of serious depression. And for her, it absolutely obliterated any ability for her to deal with those situations she had to cope with. And I grew up with a mother who was constantly battling her depression and alcoholism. And in our family, it was not something that even we talked about, even though, because we're the Kennedys and we're so progressive on mental health issues, even as my father was championing mental health coverage, in our own family, we never talked about it. And it was just internalized in me that it was not something I wanted any part of. So the last thing I wanted to grow up and be is, quote, like my mother, who couldn't, handle things. And so you can imagine, this is not, again, as you said, Muriel, a unique story to my family or to your family, but it's really a common struggle for most every family in America who knows that their loved one is suffering but can't talk about it because it's so filled with shame and stigma. So that's why I love Peter and Mimi and what they've done with focusing our Kennedy Forum here in Illinois on shattering the stigma and using that as a leverage to make real inroads in accomplishing what we all want, and that's to make sure that our loved ones who do suffer in the future are not having to deal with not only the injury of an illness, but the insult that's added to that injury of stigma, which marginalizes people simply because that illness is an illness of the brain. Now, I want to say I can't help but be here tonight and see my good friend Paul Dillon, who's a decorated Vietnam veteran and has been a champion for veterans here in Illinois, and think about the fact that it was just the other day we celebrated Veterans Day in this country. And hearing Mayor Emanuel talk about the work that the city's doing to end homelessness amongst our veterans, I have to say to all of you, I believe that it is going to be the fight on behalf of our veterans and the tragedy of the 22 suicides amongst veterans every single day in this country that is going to be the catalyst, or should be the catalyst, for our nation taking a different approach to how we treat mental illness and addiction in this country. Because understand this, the way we refer to our veterans' signature wound of the war is we call it an invisible wound. Just think about what that does to the veteran who's suffering when they think about whether they're suffering from a real illness or something that's more of a character flaw, when our country still refers to their illnesses as invisible wounds of war. We all know through brain science that there's nothing invisible, either through traumatic brain injury or there's nothing invisible to trauma itself, because when cortisol is pumping through the brain, the fight or flight response is on full time. That changes the neurophysiology of the brain. Literally, your brain is different after that kind of trauma. And so for us to say to our veterans that their signature wound of the war is invisible, we're doing them an injustice. In addition to that, we don't even afford them the Purple Heart, when for many of them, this is the wound that they suffered protecting us from another 9/11. And we add the indignity of telling them that it's invisible, and then we add the insult of saying they don't deserve a Purple Heart for that service, when we know it is a real and physical wound that they've endured. And then on top of that, our response has been largely invisible, because even all of the dollars and additional hires that we've made within the VA, we failed to do what it ultimately needs to be done, and to make sure that they get the care in a timely manner, not only through the VA, but I would add the Kennedy Forum's job in fighting for parity for all will be our veterans' priority, because parity for our patriots should be our calling card. Because once CEOs in this country recognize that within their employment are Guard and reservists, much like Governor Quinn oversaw as governor, Guard and reservists who retired, 72% of all veterans will never darken the hall of the VA in their lifetime. Let me repeat that. 72% of returning veterans will never darken the hall of the VA, which means most of those that don't come to a VA are the ones with the invisible wounds, the signature wounds of the war, which means they are going to depend on our efforts to enforce the mental health parity law. Because if their place of employment and their employer does not have mental health and addiction services to treat them as an employee, then we are letting our veterans down again by ensuring that they do not have what they need for coverage within their place of employment. I believe our employers, while not only being guided by the law, are going to be guided by a sense that they cannot afford to have a health care plan that is not effective in helping to address the needs of any of their employees, but particularly those who may be Guard and Reservists. And I'll conclude with this. If one of our veterans was ever caught in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the other places around the world where they're operating today on our behalf, protecting us from another 9/11, if any one of them were caught behind enemy lines, how long do you think it would take the United States Congress to authorize, and the President of the United States to authorize SEAL Team 6 or the Green Berets to go in there, kick down the doors, and bring them home? It wouldn't take more than a nanosecond for our country to mount the kind of response to bring our veterans home if they were ever caught behind enemy lines overseas. But you know, my friends, our veterans today are caught behind enemy lines. They're literally prisoners of their war injuries. And you, my friends, particularly those of you who are in the field of mental health, you should think of yourselves as part of the 911 response. Because now our veterans, instead of being held by Al-Qaeda, are being held hostage by their illnesses, where they feel shamed by their illnesses. They're trapped by the stigma and shame of facing these illnesses, and they're often living alone and isolated from their community. And what they need most is what everyone who has a mental illness needs, and that's someone to reach out a hand of help and love. And so for those of you in the mental health field who go out there and help people, you really are the ones that are the first responders, not only for those veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress, but for all Americans. And I believe that is going to be the calling card that unites Democrats and Republicans alike, because this is going to be the biggest test for our generation. Are we going to go the way of the Vietnam veteran, where we didn't do what it took to make sure they were treated with dignity and respect? Or are we going to correct that history and make sure that this generation of veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan is treated with the utmost dignity and respect that's so deserving of them? And the mental health movement is going to be the way we show them that they've come home in body, and that we're going to make sure they also come home in mind as well. Thank you very, very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Patrick Kennedy and our speakers, Mariel Hemingway, Peter O'Brien, and Brandon Marshall. Thank you so much. Sign up, tell your story, and join us in this battle. The band is coming back till 9:30. Enjoy yourselves, and thank you. You are not in this room. It is not an accident. You are here for a reason, and you will hear from us. Thank you so much for being here.